Your sister needed the fabric for her prom dress, so we cut up your wedding gown. Mom shrugged as I stood over the ruins. I didn't scream, I just pulled out the rental agreement. It's a vintage Vera Wang on loan from a boutique, I said softly. And the $45,000 insurance policy requires me to file a police report for intentional destruction of property. You could see the life force suddenly freeing itself from Mom's body. And that was just the least of the most devastating life lessons she's about to bitterly learn in the next 30 days. The scent of cheap aerosol hairspray filled the kitchen as my 17-year-old sister Brianna stood near the stove holding a pair of orange-handled craft scissors. Scattered across the linoleum floor were severed yards of ivory French tulle, hand-beaded chantilly lace, and the silk organza bodice that I wore during my wedding ceremony exactly 11 weeks ago. My mother, Diane, stood by the dining table with a glass of iced tea, looking at me with the absolute lack of empathy that defined my entire childhood. I had driven over to their house on a rainy Thursday morning to retrieve the gown from the climate-controlled cedar closet where Diane promised to store it safely while Robert and I spent our honeymoon in a remote cabin in Vermont without reliable internet or cell service. I walked into the house using my old spare key, expecting a quick conversation and a direct transfer of the garment bag to my trunk. Instead, I found the dining room converted into a makeshift dressmaking workshop. Brianna was attempting to construct a strapless prom gown using my wedding dress as raw material because she decided that buying a regular dress from the mall would not make her the center of attention at the high school gymnasium. Diane watched Brianna with a doting smile, holding up a piece of the delicate train to Brianna's waist to see how the lace would fall against her hip. When I stopped in the doorway, staring at the shredded remnants of the most expensive garment I would ever wear, Diane did not apologize or offer an explanation. She delivered her statement about Brianna needing the fabric with a casual flick of her wrist, as if she were explaining why she used the last of the milk for her cereal. I stood there watching the rain hit the kitchen window, feeling the absolute finality of my relationship with these two people. My father died when I was 12, and from that moment forward, Diane poured all her focus, resources, and affection into Brianna, treating me as a functional adult required to support their emotional and financial needs. I paid for my own university education by working 40 hours a week as a medical records clerk, while Diane spent my father's small life insurance payout on private horse riding lessons and designer wardrobes for Brianna. When Robert and I announced our engagement last year, Diane told me she would not contribute a single dollar to the wedding because Brianna needed a car for her 16th birthday. I accepted her refusal without argument, and Robert and I planned a modest ceremony on a strict budget. The only element I refused to compromise on was the dress. I had dreamed of wearing a specific 1996 vintage Vera Wang gown with hand-stitched floral appliques and a cathedral train, a masterpiece of bridal couture that retailed for tens of thousands of dollars. Since purchasing it was impossible, I spent months negotiating with a high-end vintage archive boutique in downtown Charlotte run by a woman named Margaret. Margaret agreed to lease me the gown, requiring a $3,500 rental fee and a $45,000 insurance bond that Robert and I scraped together using our entire joint savings. The rental agreement contained strict clauses regarding the preservation of the fabric, stipulating that any damage beyond standard dry cleaning would trigger the full payout of the $45,000 policy. I reached into my leather shoulder bag and extracted the folded paper document, laying it flat on the kitchen island right next to Diane's glass of tea. Diane looked down at the contract, her eyes scanning the bold text at the top, detailing the owner of the property as Margaret's vintage archive. "Why on earth would you rent a dress?" Diane asked, her voice rising in defensive anger as she realized she could not claim ownership of the destroyed property. "A normal person buys their wedding dress. You kept it in my closet, Carol. That implies you abandoned it here." I pointed to the signature line at the bottom of the page, where the store's return deadline was listed as this upcoming Monday. "I did not abandon it." I left it here because you have the only cedar closet in the family, and I did not want the lace to yellow in my humid apartment while we were in Vermont. I paid $4,500 for the insurance coverage alone, Diane. The policy has a criminal clause. The insurer will not pay Margaret the $45,000 unless I provide a certified police report proving the damage resulted from theft or vandalism by a third party. If I do not file that report today, the insurance company will sue me directly for the full retail value of the asset. Brianna dropped the orange scissors onto the floor with a loud clatter, her lower lip beginning to tremble as she looked from the shredded white lace to my mother's suddenly pale face. "Mum, you said she owned it," Brianna cried out, stomping her foot on the linoleum. "You said we could use it because Carol wouldn't need it anymore. I already told everyone at school that I was wearing a Vera Wang dress to prom." Diane ignored Brianna's outburst, stepping toward me with a finger pointed at my face. "You are not calling the police on your family over some old fabric, Carol. You will tell the shop that it was an accident. Tell them you spilled red wine on it or that it got caught in a door. They have insurance for a reason. Do not ruin your sister's senior year because you want to be dramatic." I looked at the scissors resting on the floor and then back at my mother. "You used kitchen shears to hack off the bodice. You cut through 30 feet of hand-stitched lace that took a master seamstress weeks to create. There is no accident that mimics the use of dressmaking shears across 3 separate layers of structured silk. If I lie to the investigators, I commit insurance fraud, which is a felony punishable by up to 5 years in state prison. I am not going to jail to protect Brianna's social status." I pulled my cell phone from my pocket and dialed the non-emergency line for the local police department, requesting a dispatch officer to report property destruction at my mother's address. Diane lunged forward, attempting to grab the phone from my hand, but I stepped back into the hallway, blocking her path with the kitchen chair. "They are on their way," I told her, my voice remaining level and devoid of the screaming rage she expected from me. "They will be here in 15 minutes. I suggest you start thinking about how you are going to explain to Margaret why her archival museum piece is currently in pieces on your kitchen floor." Brianna began to sob, loudly running out of the room and up the stairs to her bedroom, leaving Diane standing alone in the ruins of my wedding gown. Diane stared at me with pure venom, her fingers curling into tight fists at her sides. "You have always been jealous of Brianna," Diane hissed, her voice shaking with resentment. "You couldn't stand that she was going to look more beautiful at her prom than you did on your wedding day. You are doing this to hurt her, not to protect yourself." I looked at my mother and felt a sense of relief, recognizing that her opinion of me no longer possessed any power to wound me. I walked out of the kitchen and sat on the front porch steps to wait for the police car to arrive, listening to the rain fall and knowing that the dynamic of our family was about to face a massive, legally mandated audit that neither of them could escape with tears or tantrums. I sat on those cold concrete steps, reflecting on the years I had spent minimizing my own achievements to avoid making Brianna feel inadequate. When I graduated at the top of my class, Diane forgot to bake a cake because she was busy driving Brianna to a regional cheerleading competition. When I bought my first car, a used sedan with high mileage, Diane complained that the color was ugly and didn't match the house. Every milestone of my life was treated as an afterthought, while Brianna's minor achievements were celebrated as monumental victories. I had spent 24 years believing that if I worked hard enough, if I was patient enough, and if I demanded nothing, my mother would eventually look at me with the same pride she reserved for my sister. But as I watched the grey rain fall onto the pavement, I realized that some people are simply incapable of loving what they cannot use to inflate their own egos. I was too independent for Diane, too self-sufficient to need her guidance, and therefore I was useless to her narrative of being a perfect, needed mother. Brianna was helpless, dramatic, and entirely dependent, making her the perfect canvas for Diane's maternal posturing. I looked at the digital clock on my phone, counting down the minutes until the police arrived, feeling the final threads of familial obligations snap in the damp morning air. The blue and white police cruiser pulled into the concrete driveway 20 minutes later, its tires splashing through the puddles as two uniformed officers stepped out into the rain. I stood up from the porch steps and walked out to meet them, holding the folded rental agreement in my hand to establish the legal ownership of the dress immediately. Officer Henderson, a veteran patrolman with graying hair and a weary expression, listened as I explained that my mother and sister had intentionally destroyed a rented vintage gown valued at $45,000. Diane marched out onto the porch, pointing her finger at the officers and screaming that this was a private family matter that did not require law enforcement intervention. Officer Henderson looked past me at the shredded ivory tool visible through the open front door and instructed his partner to go inside and photograph the scene. Diane tried to block the doorway, claiming the officers needed a warrant to enter her home. But Henderson calmly explained that as I was the person who authorized the storage of the property in that closet and the victim of the property destruction, I had the legal right to grant them entry to view the evidence. The second officer walked into the kitchen, his digital camera flashing as he documented the ruins of the Vera Wang gown scattered across the table and the floor. Brianna's orange craft scissors were tagged and placed into a brown paper evidence bag. Diane followed the officer into the kitchen, shouting that I was a vindictive daughter who was trying to ruin her sister's prom because of a petty childhood grudge. Officer Henderson turned to me, asking if I wanted to press charges for the destruction of the property. I looked at my mother, who was glaring at me with absolute defiance, and I nodded my head without hesitation. Officer Henderson informed Diane that because the value of the destroyed property exceeded $3,000, the offense constituted a felony charge of criminal mischief in the first degree. Diane's face went white when Officer Henderson instructed her to turn around and place her hands behind her back. She began to stammer, claiming she did not know the dress was a rental and that she was just trying to be a good mother to Brianna, who could not find a suitable dress at the local boutiques. Brianna came running down the stairs when she heard the metallic click of the handcuffs locking around our mother's wrists, screaming and crying as the police led Diane out the front door and placed her in the back of the patrol car. I stood in the driveway holding an umbrella, watching the police car back out into the street with its lights flashing. Brianna ran to the edge of the yard, sobbing hysterically and screaming that I was a monster for sending our mother to jail over a pile of clothes. I did not reply to Brianna. I walked back into the house, gathered the evidence receipts from the second officer, and called Margaret at the Vintage Archive boutique to inform her of the loss of her gown. Margaret arrived at the house an hour later in her delivery van, her face drawn in tight lines of professional grief as she walked into the kitchen and looked at the remains of the Vera Wang piece. She picked up a severed piece of the hand-beaded train, her fingers tracing the ruined embroidery with a look of pure sorrow. Margaret informed me that the gown was an irreplaceable piece of fashion history from Vera Wang's early bridal collection, one of only 3 known to still exist in wearable condition. She stated that the boutique's corporate insurance policy would require a full payout of the $45,000 from my personal carrier, and that her attorneys would be filing a civil suit against Diane for the loss of business revenue the boutique would suffer from cancelled future rentals. I apologized to Margaret, handing her the police report number and my insurance agent's direct contact information. After Margaret left with the remains of the dress packed into a plastic storage bin, I locked the front door of my mother's house and drove back to the apartment I shared with Robert. Robert met me at the door, holding me tight as I handed him the police report and explained that my mother was currently sitting in a holding cell at the county jail. The following morning, the reality of the situation began to settle over the extended family. My mother's brother, my Uncle Donald, called me 3 times before noon, yelling into the voicemail that I had disgraced the family by having Diane arrested. He demanded that I go down to the precinct and withdraw the charges, claiming that no amount of money or fabric was worth putting a mother behind bars. I ignored Donald's calls and spent the afternoon speaking with the claims investigator from the insurance company. The investigator was thorough, requiring copies of the rental contract, the police report, and a notarized statement from me confirming that the destruction was intentional and not the result of an accident. He informed me that the company would pay the $45,000 to Margaret's boutique to settle the claim, but that the subrogation department would file a civil lawsuit against Diane to recover the funds. By Monday afternoon, Diane had still not been released from custody. Because she had no prior criminal record, the judge set her bail at $6,000, but Diane had no liquid savings to cover the amount. My mother had always lived paycheck to paycheck, spending all her disposable income on Brianna's expensive lifestyle while ignoring her own retirement planning and emergency fund. She called me from the jail's payphone, her voice stripped of its previous arrogance, begging me to put up the bail money using the savings Robert and I had worked so hard to build. "Carol, please, you have to get me out of here," Diane pleaded, her voice sounding thin and raspy over the recorded line. "The women in here are terrifying, and Brianna is home all alone without any food or money. I promise I will pay you back every cent once I get my tax refund next year. You cannot let your mother sit in a cage over a prom dress." I held the phone to my ear, listening to the automated voice in the background reminding us that the call was being recorded by the correctional facility. "You did not cut up a prom dress, Diane," I said. "You cut up a $45,000 piece of art that did not belong to you. You had $45,000 in your hands when you held those shears, and you chose to destroy it. I am not spending my savings to bail you out of a situation you created. Brianna is 17. She can use the microwave and take the bus to school. I will not enable your bad choices anymore." I hung up the phone and blocked the jail's number, cutting off the last avenue of manipulation. I sat in my quiet apartment, realizing that the woman who raised me was currently trading her dignity for $6,000 because she spent 15 years refusing to teach her favorite child the value of $1. Diane spent a total of 32 days in the county jail before her public defender was able to negotiate a plea deal with the district attorney's office. Because the physical evidence was absolute and the insurance company was pushing for prosecution to justify their subrogation claim, the district attorney refused to drop the charges to a misdemeanor. Diane was forced to plead guilty to a reduced charge of third-degree criminal mischief, receiving a sentence of 3 years of supervised probation, 100 hours of community service, and a mandatory restitution order to repay the insurance company the full $45,000. To avoid serving actual prison time on a felony conviction, Diane had to liquidate her state employee pension fund, which she had been paying into for 15 years while working as a clerk at the municipal water department. The early withdrawal penalties and the tax liabilities consumed a massive portion of the fund, leaving her with barely enough money to satisfy the restitution order and cover the fees for the private defense attorney she had to hire when the public defender's office determined her pension made her ineligible for free legal aid. My mother, who had spent her entire adult life believing she could manipulate her way out of any consequence by crying or playing the victim, was suddenly faced with a barren financial future and a permanent criminal record that resulted in the immediate termination of her employment with the city government. I did not attend the sentencing hearing, nor did I respond to the barrage of angry texts Brianna sent me from their house, accusing me of stealing their future and forcing them to live in poverty. Robert and I had successfully moved into our new apartment in Charleston, South Carolina, 300 miles away from the toxic environment that had suffocated me for so long. We spent our weekends exploring the historic squares, eating at local cafes, and building a life founded on mutual respect and shared effort. 2 months after the court date, I received a final package from Margaret at the Vintage Archive Boutique. She had sent me a custom-bound leather photo album containing high-definition prints of my wedding day, featuring several close-up shots of the intact Vera Wang gown as I walked down the aisle. A handwritten note from Margaret was tucked into the front cover, thanking me for my honesty and for ensuring that her boutique was made whole after the disaster. She wrote that while the physical garment was gone forever, the documentation of its beauty and the integrity I showed in protecting it had earned her lifelong respect. I sat on our new sofa, flipping through the pages of the album, looking at the photographs of myself smiling next to Robert. The gown in the pictures looked magnificent, the hand-stitched lace catching the sunlight as it trailed behind me on the grass of the courtyard. I realized that the physical fabric was just thread and silk, and while its destruction by my mother's hand was a deep and cutting betrayal, it did not possess the power to diminish the reality of the commitment Robert and I made to each other. Brianna was forced to take a part-time job as a cashier at a local discount supermarket after school to help Diane cover the monthly utility bills and property taxes on the house, a dose of harsh reality for a girl who had never been expected to lift a finger to contribute to the household. The local high school gossip had been merciless, with the story of the cut-up wedding dress and the police arrests circulating through the student body, ensuring that Brianna's senior year was defined by a different reality rather than the queen-like adoration she had demanded. I closed the photo album and placed it on the bookshelf in our living room, next to the books and mementos that defined our new beginning. I have spent the subsequent months reflecting on what I would tell someone who finds themselves anchored to family members who view their boundaries as personal insults and their property as communal assets. Biology does not grant anyone the right to vandalize your life, and you do not owe your future or your freedom to protect people from the natural outcomes of their own deliberate malice. When my mother held those scissors and decided that my wedding gown was just scrap fabric for her favored child's prom, she made a conscious choice to sever the bond between us, and filing that police report was simply the act of recording that severance in the eyes of the law. I do not feel guilt for the pension she lost or the job she forfeited, and I do not feel responsible for Brianna's ruined social standing because those consequences were birthed from their own suffocating arrogance. Robert walked into the room, handing me a glass of water and asking what I wanted to make for dinner, his presence a steady reminder of what genuine love and partnership actually look like. I took his hand, looked out the window at the moss-draped oak trees lining the Charleston street, and realized that by refusing to scream, refusing to lie, and simply allowing the law to do its job, I had finally built a life that no one else could cut to pieces. I let the silence of our new home fill the spaces where their screaming used to live, understanding that true peace is not the absence of conflict, but the courage to let the people who hurt you face the absolute gravity of their own choices without stepping in to save them.